Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of Hey, it's the NFL guys. Recapping the 2022 NFL season, week 3. And yeah, um, I did not do too well on my picks this week. Overall, I am 23 and 20 with one tie. I went 6 and 10 this week. Um, I won on the Browns over the Steelers. I got that right. The Titans over the Raiders. The Ravens over the Patriots. The Eagles over the Commanders. The Bears over the Texans. And I got the Rams over the Cardinals right. And I lost on the Bills. The Dolphins won. I took the Jets. So, boy, was I wrong there. I thought the Jets could upset the Bengals. I was wrong there. I took the Saints over the Panthers, and that didn't happen. That kind of shocked me. The Lions lost a close one, so I lost on that matchup. I lost on the Chiefs, which, oh my God, what an embarrassing loss to the Colts. I lost on the Chargers against the Jags. Wow, I tell you what, the Jags really spanked the Chargers. But we'll get that into that here in a little bit. I lost on the Buccaneers matchup. I can't believe that outcome. I lost on the Seahawks, and I lost on the 49ers and Giants. So yeah, it was just not a good week for my picks. Hey, Jimmy Baba Ganoush, like, how did you do on your fantasy football for week 3?
Oh, it's so frustrating.
Yeah, yeah, it was definitely frustrating for me too. I don't think I really did all that well this week. Sorry. Um, anyway, let's get into the recap of the NFL week 3. That was week 3, and this talk about how everybody did in fantasy football. So the Browns defeated the Steelers 29-17. Jacoby Brissett had 17 fantasy points. Nick Chubb had 17 fantasy points. Kareem Hunt, 6 fantasy points. Kareem Hunt was definitely pretty quiet this week. Mari Cooper had a pretty good fantasy football week. 16 fantasy points for him. And on the Steelers side, Najee Harris had 10 fantasy points. Deontay Johnson had 8 points. Mitchell Trubisky, 14 points. And Chase Claypool, only 4 points. I mean, maybe it's because it's Mitch Trubisky. Maybe that's why, he's not doing all that well. But you remember, like, was it last year? Or was the year before his rookie year? I think everybody, like, Chase Claypool was a hot pickup once, um, you know, um, Big Ben was finding him. So, yeah, uh, not a really good fantasy year for Chase Claypool so far. The Dolphins. Oh my God, that game was crazy. Like, Josh Allen making the pass. I forget it. I don't know if it was McKenzie or if it. I know it wasn't Stephon Diggs. I don't think it was Gabe Davis. I'm pretty sure it was McKenzie that Josh Allen threw the pass through. They were towards the end of the game, and then he didn't get out of bounds, and they raced up and tried to spike the ball, but um, the time ran out, and Bills fans everywhere watching that game was like, God fucking damn it! Exactly. Exactly. Yeah. It was the Dolphins. I said it in my week 3 picks. I said if the Dolphins, I was telling my friends, I'm going to telling few of my other fantasy football friends that if the Dolphins beat the Bills, I think they are for real. So anyway, on fantasy side, Tua had 11 fantasy points, and Tua ended up leaving the game because I thought he had a concussion. Like, he smacked his head hard, but I don't think it was a concussion. I think he had like a neck and back problems. So I'm hoping he's okay. Tyreek Hill, what a disappointing game. But I kind of give Tyreek Hill a pass. He only had 3 fantasy points, but they were facing the Bills defense. So I'm going to let him slide this week for a bad fantasy week. Jalen Waddle, 11 fantasy points, and Chase Edmonds, 14 fantasy points and 2 touchdowns. Chase Edmonds had a really good fantasy week. Josh Allen had 26 fantasy points. Stephon Diggs only 7 fantasy points. But I think Stephon Diggs was dealing with some heat exhaustion. So I think heat really got to him. So I don't think that's the why he didn't perform all that well. Devin Singletary with 15 fantasy points and Gabe Davis 3 fantasy points. The Bengals defeated the Jets 27-12, and like I said, this was my upset pick, and I just thought maybe the Jets would have some momentum going forward. I thought Joe Flacco might be like, okay, he had a really good game last week. But yeah, this week not so much. Joe Burrow 23 fantasy points. Joe Mixon only 3 fantasy points. Jamar Chase 6 fantasy points. Tyler Boyd was the star of the game. He had 16 fantasy points. And on the Jets side, Joe Flacco 3 fantasy points compared to having 26 last week. Garrett Wilson with 6 fantasy points and Breece Hall with the 9 fantasy points. Well, this is a outcome that Raiders fans did not want to hear, but the Titans defeated the Raiders 24-22, and the Raiders are 0-3, and Devontae Adams is probably thinking what other Raider fans are thinking. They're probably saying,
what the fuck is going on in here on this?
Exactly. What the fuck is going on? What is going on? Like 0-3. What is the answer? Is it the offensive line? Is it the defense? Is it Derek Carr? I don't know. I'm not really truly invested into Derek Carr. Like, I'm really not. I think he's decent. Is he great? No. Is he good? Yeah, he's in the good, okay range. But man, Devontae's probably like, God, I should have just stayed in Green Bay. So, I didn't really look at the week 4 schedule yet, so I don't know who the Raiders play. But it'll be interesting if I pick the Raiders tomorrow night when I do my week 4 picks. This one is kind of a shocker. The Panthers defeated the Saints 22-14. Shake and bake. Baker Mayfield with 10 fantasy points. Christian McCaffrey with 11 fantasy points. When is Christian McCaffrey going to blow up? Like, he hasn't had that game where he has like 28 fantasy points, 27 fantasy points, 28, where he's up in the high 20s. Like, I don't know what's going on. Like, I have no idea what's going on with Christian McCaffrey. I mean, he's having an okay season, but a great season? No. Jameis Winston had 14 fantasy points. Alvin Kamara with only 5 fantasy points. And I know he's, I think he went out of the game with an injury, but I don't think he's 100%. Michael Thomas also is dealing with an injury, but I'll get to that in a little bit. And probably the start of the game, if I'm going to mispronounce his last name, Chris Olave, 14 fantasy points for him. Moving on, the Ravens won 37-26 over the Patriots. Lamar Jackson, 39 fantasy points. What a great fantasy week he had. Also, Mark Andrews with a really good fantasy week. He had 20 fantasy points. J.K. Dobbins, first game back with only 4 fantasy points. Rashad Bateman, 3 fantasy points. and Devin Duvernay only 8 fantasy points. On the Patriots side, Mac Jones 15 points. We're going to get to him in a little bit. Damian Harris 10 fantasy points. Ramondre Stevenson had a really good fantasy week, 16 fantasy points. If you picked up Ramondre up this week and started him as your flex, good job on that roster move up to the starting spot for him. Nelson Aguilar, 2 fantasy points. And I don't know if that's because Mac Jones got hurt, because last week Nelson Aguilar had 17 fantasy points. Wow, a big difference compared to last week. The Lions lost 28-24, which, oh my gosh, what a finish by the Vikings. That was a really great game. Kirk Cousins, 18 fantasy points. Dalvin Cook, 13 fantasy points. Justin Jefferson, 1 fantasy points. Unbelievable. Adam Thielen, 12 fantasy points. On the Lions side, Jared Goff, 13 fantasy points. Amon St. Brown, 7 fantasy points. Jamal Williams had a really good fantasy week, 22 fantasy points. And DeAndre Swift, 4 fantasy points. And we're going to talk about DeAndre Swift in a little bit. Eagles defeated the Commanders 24-8. Jalen Hurts is just keeps storming and having a really good fantasy year. 27 fantasy points. Man, why didn't I draft Jalen Hurts? Definitely I'll be looking into Jalen Hurts a lot more next year in fantasy football. A.J. Brown, pretty decent game, 14 fantasy points. Miles Sanders, 4 fantasy points. Devontae Smith, finally, he had a really good fantasy week, 22 fantasy points. And Dallas Goedert, 8 fantasy points. And on the Commander side, car wreck Carson Wentz. Well, he only had 8 fantasy points. Antonio Gibson with 10 fantasy points. Curtis Samuel, 6 fantasy points. Terry McLaurin, 10 fantasy points. He hasn't really been getting going. And Jahan Dotson, only 1 fantasy points. And he's been pretty consistent this year. It seems like he was Wentz's number 1 receiver, but he just had a really bad fantasy week. This one, I am just really, really shocked. And I was off. This was the game I predicted my score where I said it was going to be 42-13. I thought the Chiefs were just going to manhandle the Colts. Boy, was I wrong. The Chets. What was the Chets? The Colts. What was I thinking? Maybe I'm thinking of Chex Mix or something. The Colts defeated the Chiefs 20-17, and pretty much Chiefs fans are probably like,
this is fucking bullshit. Okay? These fucking assholes, these fucking assholes! The fuck is their problem, man?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Like, I was even like that way just for the fantasy football side. Like, I was just like, are you freaking kidding me? And just as a football fan, I just can't believe that the Colts won this game. Matt Ryan, 15 fantasy points. Jonathan Taylor, only 9 fantasy points. He's the same thing like McCaffrey. Like, when is Jonathan Taylor going to blow up? Michael Pittman, 7 fantasy points. Patrick Mahomes, 17 fantasy points. Travis Kelce, 13 fantasy points. CEH, 9 fantasy points. And Juju Smith-Schuster, 8 fantasy points. I am probably at the point where I am more likely going to probably drop Juju. Unless I can try to work a trade, but I don't know who I could even get. I just feel like there's probably other better receivers out there than Juju Smith-Schuster. If you have Juju Smith-Schuster, you probably already dropped him. Maybe you can put him in a package in a trade. I don't know. I don't know. Like, I can't believe like Juju Smith-Schuster is having a quiet fantasy year. I honestly thought he would be the sleeper pick this year. to really blow up on the wide receiver side of fantasy football, and apparently it is not that way. Well, this is a game I like to talk about. My Chicago Bears defeated the Texans 23-20. I just don't know like what is happening with the Bears passing game. Like it's just not there. I mean, the running game is decent, but it's just the passing game is got to get going. I don't know if it's just like Eberflus is not like trusting Fields or it's Getsy. Something has to be solved where the passing game is got to get going. David Montgomery only 1 fantasy points. Justin Field 4 fantasy points. Oh my gosh. Unbelievable. Darnell Mooney 2 fantasy points. Oh my gosh. You probably dropped all your Bears players except for probably David Montgomery, and Khalil Herbert is going to probably be a very hot pickup this year or this week, which I'm going to probably stick a couple players on the IR and try to pick up Khalil Herbert, pick up my bear. Khalil Herbert, monster game, 28 fantasy points. And on the Texan side, Dawson Mills, or Davis Mills. Did I say Dawson Mills? I keep saying David Mills. I keep thinking his name is David Mills. It's Davis Mills. 11 fantasy points, or no, excuse me, 9 fantasy points. Damian Pierce, 11 fantasy points, and Brandon Cook, only 2 fantasy points. So, yeah, not too much going for the Texan side of fantasy football. The Chargers drop the game to the Jags 38-10, and pretty much, hey, let me talk to the great one, the Brahma Bull, the Rock. What do you think about your Chargers losing to the Jacksonville Jaguars?
It's the biggest piece of dog shit that I have ever heard. Everyone's laughing, by the way, but it's true because everybody's heard it too. Everyone heard it, right? They look at all. Everyone's like, "Yeah, big piece of dog shit."
Exactly, a big piece of dog shit. I mean, okay, Rock, come on. I mean, Keenan Allen is hurt, and Justin Herbert is not 100%. So you gotta give the Chargers are a little bit of credit. Like they're not 100%. So the Jacksonville Jaguars pulled off a big win. Trevor Lawrence, really good fantasy week, 25 fantasy points. James Robinson, a really good fantasy week, 17 fantasy points. Christian Kirk, another good fantasy points. He's like the only one that's been really relevant. The last 3 weeks, double points. If Christian Kirk is available, pick him up. I might start starting him over a lot of people. Travis Etienne, 7 fantasy points. Chargers side, Justin Herbert, 12 fantasy points. Austin Eckler, 5 fantasy points. And Michael Williams, 7 fantasy points. The Rams defeated the Cardinals 20-12. Matt Stafford had 10 fantasy points. Cooper Kupp, 12 fantasy points. Cam Akers, 10 fantasy points. And Darrell Henderson, only 1 fantasy points. Like, why weren't they running with Darrell Henderson that much? Only 1 fantasy point? Kyler Murray, 13 fantasy points. James Conner, 5 fantasy points. Marquise Hollywood Brown, 14 fantasy points. And Zach Ertz, 4 fantasy points. The Buccaneers defeated the... Or no, excuse me. I apologize. I was looking at that wrong. The Packers defeated the Bucs 14-12. And yeah, what was happening on that play there on what was it on the 2 or 3 when they just ran out of time, the play clock ran out? like pretty much Buccaneers fans were yelling at their TV.
Well, screw you! Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. They were probably like, screw you, Tom Brady, for, pulling that bullshit. On the fantasy side, Aaron Rodgers, 16 fantasy points. Aaron Jones, only 2 fantasy points. A.J. Dillon, 3 fantasy points. And Alan Lazard, not bad, 10 fantasy points. He had a double point week. Tom Brady, only 14 fantasy points. Leonard Fournette, 7 fantasy points. And Russell Gage, 12 fantasy points. And yeah, the Buccaneers is very, very, very hurt. And Mike Evans will be back in week 4. Thank God I can start him. At least Tom Brady will have somebody to throw to. I mean, Russell Gage had an okay fantasy week. He had 12 fantasy points, so. Moving on, the Falcons defeated the Seahawks 27-23. Marcus Mariota, 15 fantasy points. Cordell Patterson's having a really good fantasy year, 21 fantasy points. Derek London. Drake London. Yeah, Drake London, 11 fantasy points. Man, I must be getting tired. I can't even read people's names. Kyle Pitts, 8 fantasy points. And on the Seahawks side, Geno Smith, 18 fantasy points. Rashad Penny, 6 fantasy points. DK Metcalf, 12 fantasy points. And Tyler Lockett, only 7 fantasy points. And on the Sunday night game, the Broncos defeated the 49ers 11-10. Like, wow, that was a high-score baseball game. I just kind of was watching up till, I think the second quarter, and then I turned it off. I'm like, yeah, I didn't really have anybody going in this game, except for, I don't even think I started Cortland Sutton. I think the only thing I had going in that game was San Francisco's defense. I think that was the only thing I had going. So, yeah. Russell Wilson, 9 fantasy points. Javonte Williams, 6 fantasy points. Cortland Sutton, 9 fantasy points. Melvin Gordon, not a bad fantasy week, 11 fantasy points. And Jerry Jeudy, I think he just came back, so 1 fantasy points for Jerry Jeudy. On the 49ers side, Jimmy G, 8 fantasy points. Deebo Samuel, 7 fantasy points. Brandon Ayuk, 9 fantasy points. And George Kittle, at first game back, 4 fantasy points for him. And the Monday night game, the Cowboys defeated the Giants 23-16. Wow, I can't believe it. Man, I have to check how many points I got from Dallas's defense. The way that Daniel Jones kept getting sacked last night. Cooper Rush, 12 fantasy points. Ezekiel Elliott, well, look at Ezekiel Elliott, 13 fantasy points. I benched him because I was just I don't know. I don't know if I'm invested in Ezekiel Elliott anymore. CeeDee Lamb, pretty good fantasy week, 14 fantasy points. And Tony Pollard is 10 fantasy points. I had Tony Pollard going for the Monday night game. I think that was the only player I had going was Tony Pollard for the Monday night game. And I actually like him better starting him than Ezekiel Elliott. So I might pick up Tony Pollard in a few of my leagues. Daniel Jones, 13 fantasy points. And Saquon Barkley, 18 fantasy points. Now we are going to get into the player of the week. And there was possibly another player I was looking at. But you know what? I am just going to give this award to this single player because he really stepped up in place of the starting running backs being injured. But anyway, hey, Jimmy Babaganoush, hit that drum roll. So, it's the NFL, guys. Player of the week goes to Khalil Herbert. 20 carries, 157 yards, and 2 touchdowns. And like I said, I think he's going to be a very hot pickup. So congratulations to my bear, Khalil Herbert, for being, It's the NFL Guys Player of the Week. All right, next. Well, we have those players who sometimes want to get an extra sleepy sleep time and fluff their pillow up and be like, you know what? I'm not going to play my hardest today. It's Sunday. I'm going to take it easy. So, my two players, even though, they won, this is more of the fantasy side. And, they didn't really have a great game either. Those two players who should have stayed in bed on Sunday goes to the double shot Bengals. Joe Mixon, who had 12 carries for 24 yards, no touchdowns, and Jamar Chase had 6 catches for 29 yards and a touchdown. So, yeah, not a great performance by Joe Mixon and Jamar Chase. Yep, exactly. So, anyway, next we are going to look into some injury news. Joe Mixon did have a sore ankle, so maybe that's why he really didn't play too much. So reports are saying that it's not serious and he should be good to go for week 4. Michael Thomas of the New Orleans Saints has a toe injury, and they're still evaluating the toe injury. So his status for the, which is it the, no, are they playing London or is it, no, are they playing the London game? I can't remember if it's the Saints playing the London game. I can't remember offhand. If they are, then he's, his status is up, uncertain. Also, Traquan Smith suffered a concussion, so he's going through protocol. His uncertainty for playing in week 4, who knows? Jarvis Landry has a high ankle sprain. His status is unknown. Mac Jones has an ankle injury, possible surgery. He could be out 4 to 6 weeks, and some even analysts is saying that he is done for the year. So the next guy up, I believe, is Brian Hoyer, the former Bear. So yeah, I don't know if Mac Jones is going to even come back this year. I don't know if the Patriots are going to just stick with Brian Hoyer, or they're going to try to move on and try to find a different replacement quarterback. Amon St. Brown for the Detroit Lions has an ankle injury. DeAndre Swift has a shoulder injury. He won't need surgery, but it's being reported that he could miss maybe a possible up to 3 to 4 weeks. So, man, if you have DeAndre Swift, like right now, just not even listen to my podcast, like jump right on ESPN, Yahoo, NFL.com, and pick up a waiver wire for Jamal Williams, because I feel like it's going to be a few weeks before DeAndre. Why was I saying DeAndre? DeAndre Swift comes back. Dalvin Cook has a shoulder injury. He might play in week 4. Also, David Montgomery has an ankle and knee injury. This is not good, but it's also a good and bad situation. But thank God the Bears have Khalil Herbert, because there's rumors that it could be minor. He could miss 2 weeks. The worst scenario rumor is he could miss 3 to 6 weeks and possibly up to 2 months. So yeah, it's not looking good for David Montgomery, but I'm sure I'll probably hear more news coming this weekend, possibly tomorrow. I'll check the injury news, so we might do another injury update for you fantasy players that have some of these players. And AJ Green has a knee injury. So they're going to do further testing on AJ Green's knee injury. So anyway, I think that is it, ladies and gentlemen. Oh, you know what? I almost forgot my other segment, and I should have done this before. Before I go, I almost forgot this segment. So for my 4 players to shine, before I go, I always pick a quarterback, running back, receiver, and tight end, and try to guess their fantasy points. Well, this week I went with Patrick Mahomes. I predicted Patrick Mahomes was going to have a big fantasy week, 41 fantasy points. Well, he only finished with 17, so I missed it by 24. I got to come within 5 points of their fantasy points for the to get it right. Nick Chubb's, I predicted he was going to have 28 fantasy points. He only ended up with 11. Michael Thomas, I predicted that he was going to have 24 fantasy points, and he only had 4, so I missed it by 20 points. This is the closest. I predicted Cole Kmet was going to have 13 fantasy points. He ended up with 4, so I missed it by 9. And then my other segment, I do the 3 bold predictions. At number 3, I predicted Saquon Barkley was going to rush for 125 yards or more and 2 touchdowns. Well, Saquon had 14 carries for 81 yards and a touchdown. Number 2, I predicted Stephon Diggs was going to have 138 yards receiving and 2 touchdowns. Well, Stephon Diggs only had one catch for 74 yards and 0 touchdowns. And Patrick Mahomes, well, I predicted that he was going to pass for 400 yards and 4 touchdowns. Well, he had 262 yards and 1 touchdown. So, yeah, I was definitely off. So, anyway, that is going to do it for me tonight. I will definitely talk to you guys tomorrow when I do my week 4 picks. So yeah, and I just wanted to say real quick to all my listeners who might be tuning in from Florida, Hurricane Ian is making his way to you guys. So I just want everybody to be safe. Take care of yourselves, and God bless everyone there in Florida. And until tomorrow, until I do my picks, hopefully everybody has a great evening. Take care, and I'll talk to you guys tomorrow night. Take care.